If one day someone is forced to walk across burning iron bars just to prove their innocence, would anyone have the courage to take that step? Welcome to a slice of history where faith, endurance, and justice were once placed on the same scale. This is not just a dark chapter of the Middle Ages, but a testament to how humanity once sought truth through fire. In the dusty square of a medieval village, 3 glowing iron bars quietly rest on the ground. There are no ropes, no shackles, but to the accused, they stand as an invisible wall of prejudice and faith. The trial by fire, an ancient method of judgment, widely practiced across Europe, from the 9th to the 12th century. There, the accused were not acquitted by testimony or evidence, but by their bare feet stepping across red-hot iron. If, days later, the wounds healed, they were declared innocent. If not, the verdict was considered delivered. People believed, if someone was truly pure, the fire would not harm them. It wasn't just folk belief. It was a religious rationale. God will protect the innocent. Yet, this ritual was not simply a test of physical endurance. It reflected a society that surrendered its judgment to an unseen force, where religious faith, fear of isolation, and dominant power merged into an unquestionable system. The accused often had no choice. They could not refuse the trial. There were no lawyers, no defending witnesses, no investigative procedures. All that remained was one thing: the silence of the community and a solitary walk through the fire. This trial was once common across many regions: England, Germany, Northern Europe, and parts of France. Among the records that survived, some stories became legendary. One of them was the story of Rúna, a young girl from Iceland. She left the entire village in shock when she crossed the burning iron with almost no visible injuries. People called it a miracle, but later the village learned her father was a blacksmith. He had taught his daughter how to stay calm under heat, how to step quickly and lightly, and may have used technical tricks to partially shield her feet. Since then, belief in the miracle began to waver. Villagers whispered, could divine justice be prepared in advance? And if so, was that justice still worthy of trust? After walking across the iron, the accused would be taken to a secluded room, their feet carefully wrapped in herbs or cloth. 3 days later, a priest or community leader would remove the bandages to inspect the wounds. There were no machines, no doctors, only eyes and judgment, and sometimes fear. If the wound dried, it was considered healed. The person was declared innocent. If the burns remained visible or showed signs of festering, they were deemed guilty. No further defense was needed. But the true weight of the trial did not lie in the heat of the iron, but in how society entrusted the fate of a human life to a symbol that could not be verified. This trial left not only physical pain, but also made the very concept of justice fragile and breakable. Justice is often compared to a scale, but in this era, That scale was placed over fire, and instead of measuring truth, it measured endurance. Looking back from the present, we may call it superstition or irrationality. But in that era, the trial by fire was the product of a complex social system, where law was still primitive, where the words of the church outweighed kings, and where people believed that truth must come with sacrifice. Religious faith was not merely personal belief, it was a system of control. Fear did not come from the fire, but from the threat of being cast out if one refused the justice ritual. People didn't believe they would survive the trial, but they also didn't dare to refuse it. Today, when we look back at that past, perhaps what lingers in our minds is not just the burning iron, but the invisible power that once governed an entire society through faith and fear. Perhaps the most frightening thing was not the heat of the flames, but the fact that those flames were once considered the measure of truth. The trial by fire was not merely an ancient ritual. It was a mirror, reflecting how people once sought justice by surrendering everything to what they could not fully understand. It shows us that when truth is replaced by endurance, justice becomes a game of chance, and faith, without reason, can burn away even what is most right. In a dim wooden room, light seeps only through narrow cracks between old, weathered planks. The space is almost motionless. No one speaks. There are no sounds of interrogation or accusation, only the lingering silence, so deep that one can hear the sound of their own breath. The scent of dried herbs blends with the musty smell of old wood and the faint scent of burnt bandages, creating an atmosphere that is both serene and tense. The air here feels neither like a torture chamber nor like a place of healing. It is a space caught between two worlds, between life and the sentence awaiting decision. The accused lies still on a low wooden bed, their feet carefully bandaged, after walking across the burning iron. No one is allowed to touch the wound, not even themselves. 3 days of waiting, no care, no treatment. The guard is only permitted to leave a small bowl of water and a piece of bland bread. No one may enter, no one may speak, no one may alter the outcome that has already been set. In many ancient records, this ritual is described as 3 days entrusted to God. People believed if the wound healed naturally, it was a clear sign that divine will has decided. No verification, no reconsideration. Everything, even life itself, was placed in the hands of a sacred silence. Some have said the hardest part was not the pain, but the uncertainty of what would come next. No one knew if tomorrow would bring an end. No one knew if they would wake the next morning. In that room, time did not pass by the clock, but by the beat of the heart. Each wave of numbness, each dull, aching pulse, felt like a quiet reminder that the body was waiting for a sentence it could not plead against. Sometimes, faint sounds drifted in, Footsteps of the guards in the corridor, the wind whistling through the wooden roof, or the distant voice of a child saying, "If it heals, they'll be set free, right?" Beben. An innocent question, but it strikes at the very heart of the matter. If justice is entrusted to something unverifiable, can the truth ever truly be within our reach? Historical records mention a case from the year 1080. A man named Thierry was accused of stealing from the church. He accepted the trial by fire. After 3 days, the overseer unwrapped the bandages and confirmed the wound was dry, no festering, no swelling. He was declared innocent. But just a few hours later, Thierry passed away. No investigation, no autopsy. No one dared say anything, except a single phrase, repeated like a sacred chant. God has willed it. The real cause of death was never verified. Exhaustion? Infection? Or simply the consequence of a belief system that did not place humanity at its center? The answer faded into oblivion, but the question remains, still unanswered. During this period of isolation, many began an inner dialogue with their own memories. No one forced them to remember. No one demanded repentance. But the mind, when squeezed by loneliness and uncertainty, often reopens old pages. Some recalled words they never had the chance to say. Some thought of a small mistake, long forgotten, and some simply wished to return to an ordinary morning where no one demanded proof through fire. On the second day, their sense of reality slowly distorted. There was no clear boundary between memory and hallucination. Some described hearing their own names called, even though the room was completely empty. Some dreamed they walked across the burning iron again. But this time, the iron was no longer hot. It had turned ice cold. And they collapsed, amid distant laughter, as if echoing from an unseen court. It was not the pain, but the waiting itself, that became the longest trial. When there was nothing left to do, one was forced to face themselves, and face a judicial system in which they had no power to intervene. Then the third day arrived. No bells, no announcement, only sudden light pouring in as the wooden door swung open. A group entered. They said nothing. No congratulations, no judgment. They simply performed the final ritual. A man wearing white gloves approached. The bandages were removed, layer by layer, slowly, carefully, as if each layer held a question waiting to be answered. No one in the room dared to breathe heavily. All eyes were fixed on the wound, now revealed. No redness, no swelling, no sign of infection. The man nodded, a ceremonial nod, as if confirming something long agreed upon. God has borne witness. The clerk quietly recorded it in the ledger. The accused remained lying still. No cries, no tears of joy, only empty eyes gazing at the wooden ceiling. One survived, but perhaps what they truly felt was not relief, but a profound silence. as if stepping out of a nightmare, crafted by society itself. A ritual, not born to seek justice, but to preserve a belief, even if the price was human life. Under the shade of an old roof, the survivor sat quietly, his feet still carefully wrapped in bandages, like a lingering scar from the ritual just endured. A few pieces of dry bread and a bit of cold water were placed before him, not as a meal, but as a post-ritual formality, simple yet haunting. Around him, the crowd kept their distance. No one dared to sit nearby. No one said a word. But the surrounding silence was enough to say that he no longer belonged to the ordinary life of the community. In their eyes, the one who passed through the trial by fire was not merely someone fortunate enough to survive. He had become a living symbol of faith, of God's chosen will, or perhaps of something beyond human comprehension. Some believed he had been forgiven. Others feared that such forgiveness carried an unseen price. And from those cautious glances, a silent question gradually grew. Was the trial by fire truly about seeking the truth, or merely a religious ceremony designed to maintain order in a society always afraid of chaos? Many modern historians believe that rituals like the trial by fire did not entirely stem from superstition, but were tools of social control, wrapped in a cloak of morality, of belief, and of fear. When doctrine and law became one, justice no longer relied on evidence or reason, but was entrusted to divine will. In the Middle Ages, the church was not merely a place for sermons. It was the center of power, education, judiciary, and community life. Most people then were illiterate. For them, each ritual was an unquestionable truth. Every event witnessed was accepted as absolute reality because they had no tools to question it. One ancient account tells of a priest in southern Germany. By mistake, he heated a sword instead of the proper trial iron. The accused afterward suffered severe injuries, but instead of voicing protest, the entire community remained silent. Not because they did not see the injustice, but because the phrase, God's will, was enough to extinguish all doubt. Belief at that time did not exist only inside the church. It wove itself into lullabies, everyday conversations, and even the games of children. A child who dared question the trial by fire could be considered impious. Refusing the ritual was equivalent to rejecting the entire community. And living outside the community was a punishment that needed no formal sentence. There was a record of an old woman selling vegetables in the village market. Her produce was cheaper than others. People whispered, she must have used witchcraft to keep her vegetables fresh. That rumor alone was enough to bring her to trial. No evidence was needed, only the weight of collective fear. The survivor, recalling the eyes of the crowd that day, did not see anger, nor did he see compassion. He saw only one thing. They were waiting. Not waiting for him, but waiting for a miracle. something that could confirm the order they believed in still existed, even if that order was a cold one. Not everyone accepted this. There were those who tried to speak reason and truth. A judge in Switzerland became known for refusing to carry out the trial by fire. He argued, "We cannot let a ritual replace proper investigation." But the response he received was not a conversation. He was dismissed from his position, even put on trial for defying the church. At that time, public reason could itself be considered a sin. The survivor returned to his small house on the edge of the village. The path was overgrown with weeds. The wooden door stood ajar, covered in thick dust. Inside, traces of rummaging remained, as if someone had searched for something, then quietly left. No one vandalized, but no one preserved either. Everything was left for time to do its work, to let it fade away. As night fell, when no more eyes watched him, only the sounds of insects and the wind whistling through the old roof remained. In that darkness, there were no visible wounds, but in their place was a quiet, persistent weariness, not of the body, but of an unease that could not be named. Even though he had been declared innocent, he could never be sure whether he had truly been believed. He had survived the trial, but perhaps that trial should never have existed. One day, the man who had once walked through the trial by fire was called back to the village square. But this time, he was no longer the central figure, no longer the one to be judged, no longer carrying fear or vague hope. He was merely a silent witness among a silent crowd. The accused that day was a young girl. Her name was never recorded, but the things she carried were still remembered. She knew how to grow vegetables without much water, how to bake bread without using yeast, and how to use roadside herbs to ease pain for the sick. No one said she had done wrong. No one found any clear crime. But still, they brought her to the square. The reason? She was too different. 3 iron bars were heated red once again. Among the onlookers, the man who had once crossed the fire recognized one of the bars. It still bore the faint marks of his own footprints and blood from years ago. Though time had passed, the darkened stain on the iron's edge remained, like a memory never properly buried. The girl stepped forward, without resistance, without tears, without trembling. Her gaze was as calm as a morning lake. She sought no pity. She held no resentment. Only a strange serenity, as if she believed that beyond pain, there still existed something greater, quiet and fair beyond any verdict. After the ritual, she was taken to the familiar wooden isolation room. Everything proceeded according to the rules. 3 days of waiting. No one allowed to enter. No one allowed to speak. The bandages carefully wrapped around her feet. Drops of sacred oil fell upon the wooden floor. And once again, silence became the supreme guardian. But on the 3rd day, when the door was opened, she was no longer there. In her hand, she still held a dry sprig of mint, the kind of herb she often used to soothe swelling, to reduce fever in the village children. No farewell, no written note, only one final trace of gentleness. The man who had once survived did not turn away. He quietly entered the room, where the wooden walls still bore the faint burn marks from long ago. On the wall, using the tip of a burning iron, someone had carved a faint but sharp message. Fire cannot burn the truth. It was not an accusation. It was not a lament, but rather a quiet echo for those who still had the patience to listen. He sat by the window, light filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls. A gentle breeze passed by, carrying the faint scent of mint in the air. And for the first time since that year, he no longer felt fear. Not because he had grown stronger, but because he had finally understood one thing. The fire may leave burns, but it can never consume conscience and truth. The girl's story began to spark the first ripples within the community. No riots, no arguments, only silence. But this time, it carried contemplation. Some nearby villages quietly abandoned the trial by fire. They moved to other forms of judgment, through oaths at the altar, through living witnesses, or sometimes through simple, mutual silence, instead of burning iron. A silence not as scorching as metal, but enough to make people start asking questions. And in an era where questions were once considered dangerous, that was a beginning. Later, the survivor quietly left the village. There was no farewell, no anger or accusation, only a step in a different direction, because his heart had already chosen. On the path overgrown with grass, he heard the playful voices of children somewhere among the reeds. One shouted loudly, "Look out! It's the red-hot iron. Don't step on it! God will know if you do." He paused and let out a soft laugh. Not because the child was wrong, but because he understood. Sometimes what remains after the darkness is not ashes, but the innocent games of memory. And perhaps, in a world that once used fire to define the truth, the real truth survives in the smallest things: an unwavering gaze, a sprig of mint held in hand, a whispered sentence carved into wooden walls, and someone willing to listen. In the end, everything fades, like morning mist over an old field. No more burning iron, no more suspicious stares, only an open road ahead, where the wind blows through wild grass, and the sky turns a soft, pale gray. The man stopped by a small stream and dipped his hand into the water. The scar on his foot remained, not as a wound to forget, but as a memory to keep. Because sometimes, to move forward, we don't need to erase the past. We simply need to learn how to live with it. More gently, more compassionately. Overhead, a flock of birds passed by. A breath was released, no longer heavy, but peaceful. The final lesson does not come from the fire, but from how we remember it. The trial by fire was not merely a ritual of superstition. It was a mirror reflecting how people once replaced truth with fear, how judgment was handed to things that could not be verified. But from that, we also learn not everything called justice is truly right. And not everyone who survives is a victor, but they are witnesses, so that the future does not repeat the mistakes of the past.